Hi, everyone. So hello and welcome, and thanks for joining us for this webinar, Cannabis Conversations for Service Providers, Findings from a Peterborough Community-Based Research Report. I believe Sage noted or prefaced the welcome page with a note that said that this is our very first webinar, so please be kind and bear with us if should there be any technical difficulties. My name is Evan Brockist, and I've held various roles with the Peterborough Drug Strategy since 2007, and I'm currently working as the project lead responsible for the Peterborough Community Cannabis Project. In addition to my role with PDS, my background includes research, teaching, program evaluation, communications, and community development. Likewise, Sage Irwin is supporting the Community Cannabis Project with the drug strategy and is the project lead for our knowledge and skill building program, A Question of Care. They were heavily involved in the cannabis focus group research sessions in 2009, and their background is in event management and project management, though they learned to approach all subjects through an equity-focused lens. So just to begin with a bit of a brief overview of the topics that we'll be covering today, we will start with an intro to PDS and the work that we do. We're then going to provide an overview of the project, including the context, some of the challenges that we encountered in this work, as well as the approaches that informed how we actually approach the project itself. I'm cognizant of the fact that for many of you, this section will likely amount to a lot of review of topics that you're already well aware of, but this does help set the stage for the following section, which corresponds to the research. So at that point, Sage is going to take over and present the results of the community-based research that we conducted here in our community of Peterborough, Ontario, as well as discuss the implications of our findings for helping professionals. Just a quick clarificatory note around language. We define helping professionals very broadly as anyone in a position of interacting with people and providing a service. So whether you work in healthcare, a community setting, or social services, that includes you. To wrap up, we'll build in some time to answer any questions that you may have. And with that note, moving right along, we'll also just take a moment to make some disclosures. And just to note that we have no commercial or funding relationships to the cannabis industry or any other private businesses for that matter, no conflicts of interest to declare. And in terms of the funding for this project, it's being drawn from the Government of Ontario through a Proceeds of Crime Frontline Policing grant. Okay, so just beginning with a short section about us. We are a locally based, the Peterborough Drug Strategy is a locally based collaborative approach to reducing the harms related to substance use in our community. We were established in 2009, essentially in response to a broad community consultation process that found that issues related to substance use are really a primary concern for people living and working in our community. Our work tends to be very project driven. And responsive and oriented towards addressing new and emergent issues that we're seeing on the ground and from our partners. And often the kind of projects that we do respond to an area or need where there's limited capacity to respond within our existing partnering agencies or organizations. Over time, we've really found that this model of collaboration has helped us to be very comprehensive and coordinated in our approach to substance-related issues, which really does help to reduce fragmentation. It limits duplication of our efforts. It ensures that our initiatives are thoroughly evidence-based. And it also ensures that the work that we do is very responsive to local needs and tailored to the local context. To give you a bit of a sense of our structure, we follow a 4-pillar approach that includes prevention, harm reduction, treatment, and enforcement. And in our local context, the organizations responsible for those pillars are Peterborough Public Health, the Peterborough AIDS Resource Network, Forecast, and the Peterborough Police Service. Our network also includes representation from 8 other agencies, as well as community members that share the goals, mission, and vision of the drug strategy. So while all of our partners have individual mandates that bring them to this work, we do share a very common goal of reducing substance-related harms in our region through innovative evidence-based approaches. And our experience, again, has really reinforced the efficacy of this model for addressing the inherent complexity of substance use and addiction-related issues. And we've also found that working together increases our collective impact at the individual, community, and systems levels. Underlying all of this work are a set of core principles that anchor and guide how we pursue this this work at the community level, as well as the projects that we seek funding for. And so these principles in brief include collaboration, inclusion, respect, and accountability. Okay, so turning now to the project itself. The Peterborough Community Cannabis Project was conceived initially as a 2-year project that began in the summer of 2008 and will actually be wrapping up at the end of March 2020. And so like previous projects led by our drug strategy, our focus was really on capacity building and responding to local needs. So obviously with the significant legislative shift that came with cannabis legalization, we did recognize this as an area that we wanted to focus some attention. And as I mentioned recently, we did apply to the Proceeds of Crime stream to find some funding to lead this project. So just to give you a bit of a summary, the central goal of this project was to increase the capacity of health and social service providers in Peterborough City and County to respond to issues associated with cannabis legalization through the provision of evidence-based information, training, and supports. Early on in this project, we really did acknowledge that we could really not predict how legalization would impact our community or how the evidence would change over the course of the project. So despite a lot of unknown elements, we did really try to distill the project into 3 core sort of activity areas, acknowledging throughout that we would need to maintain some flexibility in our approach along the way. So really, you know, this was a very iterative project, and we assumed a very learn as we go approach. So just to review, the 3 core activities that we sort of pegged to this project included collection of local data, and the purpose for that was to assist with program planning and the identification of priority populations. One thing that we encountered is that we had really limited data when we started this project, and so we needed to fill some of those gaps. The second area of work were training opportunities for helping professionals that were to be delivered through our knowledge and skills development program, A Question of Care. And finally, we committed to stakeholder engagement, both through maintaining some availability for community requests for presentations or workshops, as well as the development of public-facing cannabis-related resources. We also really anticipated that given the nature of the shift in our legal environment and social environment, that we can anticipate a very high demand for training from service providers, as well as requests for information. This required that we put some tight parameters around the subject matter that we could address through the project, as well as some scoping around the kind of subject matter that we just couldn't pursue. So this resulted in a decision to really not provide training or entertain requests related to medical cannabis. So that would refer to the provisions of the ACMPR, or Access to Cannabis for Medical Purposes regulations. And we also determined that we couldn't provide a response to requests or consultancy related to HR issues. So that would look like cannabis in the workplace. All of this was essentially determined to be out of scope and beyond our expertise. So in addition to a series of topical workshops delivered to community groups on request, we also developed and launched a four-part training module for helping professionals in winter 2019, which covered the following themes. So we had one workshop that focused on cannabis and harm reduction, another that looked at cannabis and health, another that looked exclusively at cannabis laws and regulations, as well as a specialized session focusing on cannabis and young people or youth. Also, just to briefly review the context we entered into when we started working on this project, while there was a great deal that we didn't know pre-legalization, we knew then, and we had known for some time, that cannabis use is very prevalent in Canada. So in fact, we know that it's the most widely used substance in our country after alcohol. And according to 2017 statistics from the Canadian Tobacco, Alcohol and Drug Survey, about 50% of Canadians reported having tried cannabis in their lifetimes, with about 1 in 7 males and 1 in 10 females aged 15 and older reporting past year cannabis use, with also seeing that these levels of use were fairly consistent in Canada as compared to Ontario. So what I would say in relation to that data is that despite high rates of use, most Canadians surveyed as part of Statistics Canada's National Cannabis Survey reported that they did not intend to try cannabis despite legalization. So I think that's an important clarifying fact. Again, just to review some of the policy considerations that informed this change. Again, I suspect this will be review for many of you, but nonetheless, I think it's important to the discussion that we're having here. So first, we know that previous policy approaches around cannabis have tended to be really based on values and politics rather than sound public health evidence. And this is in part evidenced by the fact that prohibition as a policy approach has largely been unsuccessful in our context. And that's really signaled by the fact that we have high rates of use, which does indicate or suggest that the illegal status of cannabis has been really ineffective in preventing and deterring use. At the same time, we know that all of the cannabis consumed by Canadians before legalization, with the notable exception of medical cannabis, was being accessed from an unregulated source. And we know that unregulated supplies, there's no quality checks, which raises some issues there. Finally, we also know that criminalization has harms. A criminal record resulting from a cannabis offense, even a minor possession charge, can have really serious and lifelong implications that follow a person over their life course. So those were sort of the stage setting elements that informed some of the policy debates pre-October 17, 2018. Now, it really didn't take long for this well-laid plan to essentially fall apart. And this resulted in a need to reevaluate our goals, adjust our plans, and redefine how we would interpret success at the end of this project. The first change we made is that we actually delayed the data collection component until year 2. Well, this was originally scheduled for year 1 to coincide with formal legalization when the Cannabis Act became law. We soon realized that this schedule would be very unrealistic, and essentially we found that we would need more time, I guess, for the dust to settle in order to effectively assess the impact of legalization within our local context. We also sort of knew at the time and through discussion with various partners engaged in the project that if we were to have posed a series of questions to the community at this stage, we would have been really limited to an exploration of things like use prevalence or other similar indicators. And this was not really entirely helpful in our context because we had some of this data already available through existing data sets. And we also knew that rates of use are high in general. So, really what was really important to us was understanding how legalization would actually precipitate changes in attitudes, stigma around use, consumption habits, knowledge of harm reduction, and potential population health effects. And this was a need that was determined by our stakeholders. Similarly, we also encountered that while we had anticipated a very substantial demand for training, that this large volume of requests actually never materialized. And so while our staff were really busy in the lead up to legalization, these requests tend to trickle off substantially over the following months. And furthermore, while our service provider focused training solicited a very high level of registrations, we often found ourselves presenting to only a handful of participants. And if anyone has experience in running events or doing presentations in the community, you can know that this is a really frustrating experience. So this really suggested to us that perhaps some of our original assumptions around the kinds of topics that people were looking for and what they wanted to hear about may not have been fully accurate. So practically speaking, this really forced us to do some reflection. And really in terms of the first year, we spent the majority of our time reviewing and monitoring the research and data, responding to community requests for workshops and information, and learning from the efforts of other communities engaged in similar work. The bright end, the upshot of all of this is that fortunately we did eventually arrive at something that worked well. In terms of our refocusing efforts. And when we returned to data collection just this past October in 2019, we did have a much clearer picture of the kinds of questions we needed to ask. And we'll return to this discussion later in the presentation. So in addition to some of the internal challenges we faced in adapting the project to local conditions and circumstances, we also experienced several challenges external to Peterborough, as well as the Peterborough drug strategy that we had to navigate and respond to. The first challenge that we encountered, which is something that I imagine that we can all identify with, is just the emergent nature of cannabis research itself. So as we know, the legacy of prohibition has really constrained the research agenda around cannabis, and as a result, our evidence base remains incomplete. And in the absence of conclusive information, this situation really necessitated a firm precautionary approach, including key messaging on a range of subjects that, from our perspective, risk being interpreted as overly vague by the public. I think at the extreme end of this, we often encountered a need to preface each statement or key message with a caveat that spoke to the incompleteness of the state of the research, that communicated how we're still learning about this, and sort of the attending quote that, you may want to exercise caution. We sometimes found in speaking to the public that this created some legitimacy issues in the eyes of those who were engaged in our workshops or some of the social media messaging that we put out in the community. And there was sort of a perception that, basically that, this was a fairly ambiguous kind of form of communication. We did try to address this communications sort of roadblock or challenge by maintaining a really balanced approach that avoided any exaggeration of potential harms, while also being really careful to avoid presenting cannabis as entirely benign. And I think it's fair to say that we have a good sense of the research that would validate that approach, and it's something that we saw mirrored across the province. We also tried to be really conscious of how the language that we use could perpetuate and reinforce stigma. We know that, like many areas of substance use, this is a heavily burdened topic in terms of people's perceptions. So we were really careful not to inadvertently, sort of redeploy tropes like the stoner or things that would sort of reinforce a particular picture of who uses cannabis in our community and in the province. I would say that we weren't always successful in this regard. We had a few, sort of heated conversations over social media, but we did really commit ourselves to making progressive improvements based on some of the feedback that we were hearing in the community. And at a certain point, our efforts did start to pay off, and we started to sort of hit the right notes, so to speak. So also in Ontario, we encountered some unanticipated policy and regulatory changes, and this necessitated some rapid course corrections and modification to the content we had already developed in order to accommodate these changes at the political level. So for those of you who may be on the call that reside outside of Ontario, a change in government precipitated a new approach to the retail distribution model for recreational cannabis just a few months prior to legalization. So in June, the newly elected provincial government announced a shift from a phased-in approach of publicly owned cannabis stores to essentially a fully private model with a limited number of licenses awarded through a lottery system. There were also changes introduced to the places where cannabis could be legally consumed, some alignment with the provisions of the Smoke-Free Ontario Act, and as a result, the practical implication of this was that consuming cannabis in public areas such as sidewalks became permitted, whereas it had previously been prohibited. So as a result of these changes, we had to do a lot of work to understand the implications of this regulatory change, update our communications plan and some of our other content to ensure that the public was really well informed. Another issue practically was the fact that there were a lot of competing interests kind of coalescing around this issue of legalization, and this increased the potential for some conflicting messages. So on the one hand, we had industry actors that were, attempting to take advantage of a new and potentially lucrative market opportunity, and this, this generates some concern around how cannabis would be promoted from a product marketing perspective, regardless of the controls that we know exist or that are built into the Federal Cannabis Act. Also, there was the sort of phenomena of established pro-cannabis advocates or communities who are also, engaged in messaging to promote the sort of therapeutic benefits of cannabis, as well as some concerns around whether some of those statements were being exaggerated, particularly given the incomplete state of the evidence. And lastly, there was also, essentially us. There's the diverse constellation of public and community sector actors, whether that's public health, law enforcement, or community agencies, that really also had a stake in the communications around, in the lead up to legalization. So all of these factors essentially contributed to a dynamic where it often felt that we were traveling down an unmarked path, not sure of the outcome. And this really reinforced the sense that we needed to be really flexible, take an iterative approach, and we likened this to a sense of building the plane while it was in the air. So in order to grasp the context and challenges that we encountered early on in our work, it's also helpful to review some of the stories and headlines that we heard in the media just prior to legalization. And I should note, while we did not have the capacity to engage in a full media scan for this project, we did actively review the news media throughout the duration of the project. And I think this review provides some insight into how legalization is being framed in the media. So here's just a small sample of some of the headlines that surfaced before and immediately after October 17th, 2018. So I think a few things stand out in these examples, and namely, there was a somewhat sort of dire prediction surrounding, dire predictions surrounding skyrocketing use, concerns around the long-term health impacts or problems associated with cannabis use, as well as some justice system impacts. At the same time, we also heard about the economic development and growth opportunities that would flow from legal access to recreational cannabis. But it's important to note that as time passed, and some preliminary data emerged post-legalization, we quickly found out that, in fact, the sky did not fall on October 17th, 2018, as was sort of maybe reflected in some of the headlines that we were reading. So rather, we now know that the situation continues to evolve, and in hindsight, some of the predictions that we were seeing and in the media and perhaps other sources did prove to be exaggerated or just plain wrong. And while we're still researching and measuring the population health impacts of legalization, and we still don't know the full impact of newly introduced products such as edibles, national and local data does suggest some preliminary findings that warrant further review. So for example, one thing is that we have seen some increase in first-time use. These increases are somewhat small, but cannabis use prevalence has mostly remained stable, and the increases that we have seen are attributable to specific age groups, including seniors as well as adults aged 25 and 44. And I think that there's some important methodological considerations and practical considerations that relate to interpreting this data. The other thing that we've seen is that the unregulated market remains strong. This is expressed through purchasing patterns at the national level. And we just know that many people are continuing to access their cannabis from unregulated sources. And this is due in part to some of the lower prices that may be available, some privacy concerns perhaps around accessing cannabis online, and some perceived issues with product quality. At the same time, we've also seen that there really have been no significant increases in crime rates. I can really only speak to our local context, but notwithstanding some of the predictions that we heard around increases in crime and extending demand on the justice system, cannabis-related violations in multiple jurisdictions are being reported as lower than anticipated. So just for context, in our own contact community of Peterborough, there have been approximately 21 cannabis-related charges between October 2018 and February 2020 out of a population of 84,000. So fortunately, despite the need to work within and respond to these challenges, particularly in the first year of the project, we did have some sound anchors and a roadmap to work from. An important source of operational guidance up front was offered by the public health approach to legalization, and we did a lot of work to ensure buy-in and commitment to the principles, these principles with all of our partners. I suspect most of you will be familiar with this diagram, which depicts a public health approach to legalization of psychoactive substances, including cannabis. And I would note that it remains relevant beyond cannabis legalization, particularly amidst recent calls from public health officials in the country to decriminalize all psychoactive substances. So to briefly review, the basic theory here is that the greatest social and health problems around substance use can be found on the two extreme ends of the spectrum. So on the left, we have total prohibition, which creates the context for illegal and unregulated markets and all of the ancillary issues that arise from that situation. And then on the right, we have the opposite. We have unregulated legal markets, which provide the context for corporations to exploit or misuse people's substance use for profit. The sweet spot, I think, that we're all aiming for, and where, is the middle. And that's where you have a tightly regulated market which provides people with safe access to the substances of their choice, while simultaneously placing restrictions on the legal market so that it operates in the most responsible way possible. So I would note that 2 years into Canada's experiment with cannabis legalization, or 2 years into this project, we're still sort of searching for this middle ground, and that remains our goal. And remaining on this course is going to require some more time, continued efforts by public health champions and other actors, as well as responsiveness to political and economic pressures that could move us in opposite directions. So similarly, we also had the access to Canada's lower risk cannabis use guidelines. And this gave us another roadmap that is rooted in scientific evidence. So just to review, the guidelines were developed to support healthcare professionals, as well as people that use cannabis for whatever reason, to make more informed choices around their use. And the hope is that this would encourage a reduction in potential harms. So despite the relevant insights that are offered in the guidelines, their introduction and adoption did give rise to a new challenge related to knowledge translation and dissemination of these messages. This is something that we encountered quite a bit in our work. And as we'll discuss when we get to the research results of this presentation, the community response was mixed, and it wasn't always positive. So in particular, it is relevant to point out that one of the first recommendations on the list advises an abstinence-based approach. And so while we may be able to understand the science and rationale behind this recommendation from a population health or health promotion standpoint, it's relevant to note that how it creates some conflict with broader harm reduction approaches and principles. And I think to understand this fully, we do need to recognize that for some people, cannabis use can actually represent a form of harm reduction in and of itself. And again, there's still need for more research in this area, but there are increasing anecdotal and observational accounts of people using cannabis to substitute for more harmful substances, whether it be opioids or alcohol. Again, we need to wait for the research to come in, but something to consider in terms of our engagement with this tool. So in the next few slides, I provide a bit of a summary of harm reduction and a link to why this is important to consider in relation to cannabis education. So to get to the heart of this matter, it's helpful to review some general definitions and principles that underpin harm reduction in general. And we suspect that many of you will already be familiar with these points, but for clarity, when we use this term, we are referring to policies, programs, and practices that aim primarily to reduce the adverse health, social, and economic consequences of the use of legal and illegal psychoactive substances without necessarily reducing drug consumption. So in the interest of a more concise definition, we would define harm reduction as empathy, and in a sentence, it's about meeting people where they're at. Critically, however, it's a neutral, non-judgmental, low threshold and non-coercive approach to reducing substance-related harms without the expectation of abstinence. And this recognizes that total avoidance of a substance, so abstinence, may not be a realistic or attainable goal for some people. This may be the case for others, but we can't assume that. So harm reduction strives to keep a door open by offering practical information and supports that reduce harm. One thing about harm reduction is that this pertains to both individuals and the community as a whole. A good example of this in the substance use world or in the area of substance use is needle exchange programs, which we know reduce the transmission of sexually transmitted and blood-borne infections, as well as the operation of supervised consumption services, which provide a range of benefits at a community level, including reduced drug litter, less drug consumption, and all of the obvious benefits that pertain to the individual. And I would say that examples of harm reduction are everywhere in our society. There's areas that we embrace them quite naturally. Driving cars can be dangerous, so we wear seatbelts. Similarly, boating and water sports can be hazardous, so we mandate life preservers and encourage swimming lessons. I think there are countless examples of how we practice harm reduction in our everyday lives, and because they're so normal, we don't notice them. It's also a movement for social justice that's built on a belief in and a respect for the rights of people who use drugs. And it recognizes the intrinsic value and dignity of all human beings, as well as the competency of people who use drugs to make informed decisions about their lives. Effectively, it's really about moving substance use away from a sort of binary interpretation or spectrum of good or bad to a normal part of human behavior. And this shift in thinking really recognizes that this is something that we all do at certain times and to certain degrees, and that for most people who use substances, they don't get to a point where there's a particularly negative effect on their quality of life. And just to point out, this is not wishful thinking. There's ample and substantial empirical scientific evidence that backs up the efficacy of these practices. So another way to frame harm reduction is through the social determinants of health. And this concept can be well illustrated through the image of an iceberg. We use this diagram in many of the courses we offer through our knowledge and skills building program, A Question of Care. And we include it here to illustrate this point. So if you look to the surface, this is everything that we can observe when we encounter someone on the street, in our workplace, or in our workplace. And it's what essentially they're physically presenting. It's what we can tangibly observe about their appearance or their behavior. And I would say it's really easy to reach a lot of conclusions based on these observable elements. However, what we need to be constantly aware of is what we don't see. And that's everything that happened in the person's life before they walked in our door or crossed our path. And this includes everything below the surface of the water. So that's everything like social supports and culture, to child development and biology, basically all the things that subconsciously inform our values, assumptions, and beliefs about a person. I'm very appreciative and cognizant of the fact that we work in a context where we're all busy. So I'd say the goal here is not to learn someone's full story or all the pertinent details. We know that that's unrealistic. We simply don't have the time and capacity to do that kind of work. The goal, however, is to remember that there's always more, to remind ourselves that we don't know this person's full story, quite possibly never will, but there's always more than this to the situation that we have access to. And I think if we practice that this in and of itself has the potential to transform the interactions that we have and with the people that we're trying to support through our work. So empathy, drawn from our own experiences, can help establish connection, and this can help take this concept a bit further. So one way we can be more empathetic in our interactions with people who use drugs or people with lived experience is to understand our own relationship to substance use. I recognize that this can be quite difficult because many substances in our society are effectively normalized and are basically seen as socially acceptable. So a good example of this is alcohol. But we do know from the research that this is a substance that contributes a great deal of harm at a population level. But as a result of this this relative normalization and social acceptance, there tends to be much less stigma attached to the use of these substances than others. So to illustrate this point, I'd like you to use the raise your hand feature, which is located on the bottom panel of your screen. And I'd ask you to please raise your hand if any of these statements apply to you. So you need a coffee to get started in the morning. Lots of things coming up on my screen here. You need a sleep aid to get a decent night's rest. I didn't sleep well last night. I didn't take a sleep aid, but I'm feeling it today. Anyone? Yeah. So you crave sweets in a way you can't quit. Think about that cupcake you had over lunch. You periodically need a cigarette in order to function. A few more showing up here. How about you've ever had a drink to relax? Right. You've taken an aspirin for a headache. Okay. So essentially, I can't get a firm count, but I saw a lot of theoretical or metaphorical hands being raised. And I think what this exercise essentially demonstrates is that we all use substances to address a range of legitimate needs. This can be to relieve pain, whether it's physical or emotional, to relax, to reduce anxiety, to feel good, to feel alert, or to have fun. This same logic does apply to cannabis, and there are many underlying reasons why people may be using cannabis, and in fact, understanding the reasons for their use is critical to providing more effective supports when and if a person needs them. So to sort of be quite explicit about this, again, in our society, we know that we tend to focus on the harms of substance use while ignoring the reasons why people use drugs in the first place. And broadening our understanding of and attention to the underlying reasons why people may choose to use drugs helps us forge a stronger, more empathetic connection. This is the essence of meeting people where they're at, and it's a foundational approach to establishing an effective therapeutic alliance. So in attempting to answer the question posed in the heading of this slide, why do people use cannabis? There are some common themes that jump out. The first and a major reason is to feel better. The reality is that sometimes we do these things because they provide a tangible benefit in addressing our most immediate needs, whether it's relief from fatigue, pain, the stress of the day, etc. Likewise, there may be other reasons why people may choose to use cannabis, and those can include as a form of self-medication, to address anxiety, stress, trauma, and depression. And there's lots of emerging research and discussion about this. As well, others may use cannabis to enhance their ability to perform certain tasks. And more still, others may use cannabis to engage in a process of discovery, to explore new experiences, feelings, and insights. And so just this slide was really focused or really drawn from the Canadian Public Health Association's Canna Basics document, which we found quite helpful in guiding some of the communications efforts that we were doing in our community. Likewise, expanding our understanding of the reasons why people use drugs, including cannabis, can be aided by situating all substance use on a continuum. So as this this diagram on the screen helps to visually convey how a person's relationship to substance use can change over time. And it's a reminder that substance use and addiction rarely follow a linear or predetermined path. Again, for most people, substance use issues develop and change over time. Many people simply age out of substance use and require minimal need for intervention or support. So thus, while some people may experience few or no harms from their substance use, others may experience a range of negative impacts that substantially interfere with their lives. Similarly, we also know that people move back and forth on this continuum, forwards and backwards, from a position of total abstinence to recreational use, perhaps to heavy consumption, and then back again over time. So most people who use cannabis and other substances can be positioned on the left axis of this diagram, where their use can be described as mostly casual, social, largely non-problematic, and perhaps even beneficial to them. I would say that crucially, it's individuals on this end of the continuum that likely have access to some support from family or friends, should their use to begin to reach a level that they're not comfortable with. And similarly, a realistic prospect of a job, a home, a stake in society, all of these sort of foundational elements of connection and well-being or protective factors are things that can help them insulate themselves from potential harms. Unfortunately, however, we do know that there are many people that lack access to these supports, and that what this really tells us is that more work needs to be done to increase equity and reduce disparities at a population level. Also, we need to be always aware of that many issues around substance use and addiction are rooted in significant experiences of trauma and experiences of abuse, physical and psychological pain. And it's contrary to popular conceptions, but statistically it's lack of access to basic essentials and supports that precede substance use rather than succeed it. So in other words, people's lives don't just fall apart from substance use so much as people's lives fall apart, which leads to substance use. We don't have the time to go into detail about trauma, but like the iceberg, it's something that we always need to remember as present in people's lives. And I would just take a moment to emphasize that this is why health equity and the social determinants of health are so important and so foundational to any effort to reduce harm associated with whether it's cannabis or any other substances. Because just in closing, awareness of everything that exists beneath the surface of the water, that is cultivating an awareness of the factors that we cannot see, but nonetheless influence a person's experience and behavior, is really a vital component of effective and client-centered care. Okay, with that, so I'm going to pass the laptop back to Sage.
All right, hello. So as Evan said, now we're going to cover the research portion of the presentation. So we collected qualitative and quantitative data throughout through a local phone survey and focus group sessions. The phone survey was developed to collect baseline data regarding public thoughts and understanding of the lower risk cannabis use guidelines. A third-party research firm was hired to design and conduct the survey. 800 local individuals were polled via telephone with a standard set of questions being asked for each participant. We also held 6 focus groups in total with no more than 8 participants lasting 90 minutes each to assess people's reactions to the guidelines and other educational materials that address cannabis use. Most of the focus groups consisted of people from priority populations considered at risk for increased harms associated with cannabis use, so youth, older adults, and people who are pregnant and breastfeeding. We ran separate groups for each population, so older adults were on their own, youth were on their own, etc. Participants were identified through established connections to existing service providers and community partners, as well as through on and offline promotion, and they were incentivized through using food, gift cards, as well as transportation subsidies. So as Evan mentioned earlier in the presentation, we encountered a number of challenges when it came to promoting these and other cannabis related sessions that we ran. We often saw high registration numbers in our educational sessions, but then a very low turnout. So for example, for one session, we had about 45 people registered, but then only 6 people came. And then when it came to the paid promotional ads on Facebook and Twitter, we were often blocked for violating their policies around drug-related content. Sometimes we could appeal these blocks by having a person review our content and see that we're not selling drugs or promoting use, but often we were unable to get by this. This obviously made getting our sessions out there a little difficult. For this webinar, actually, I was able to circumvent this issue on Twitter by removing the word cannabis from a promoted tweet, which certainly wasn't ideal, but it was sort of the only other workaround I could think of. So we also received some backlash from community members on social media, particularly on Facebook, while promoting our sessions. Language we initially thought was pretty neutral was sometimes perceived as stigmatizing or simply misunderstood. We had to figure out how to clearly communicate that the goal of our focus group sessions was for us to ask the community about for their feedback, rather than us sitting them down for a lecture on cannabis. Words like risk and harms, when used in relation to cannabis, produce some pretty strong reactions. We had to learn how to carefully navigate the language we used around these strong emotions, as well as the various perspectives that community members held. So up here on the screen, I've included 2 promotional posters for the focus groups that we ran. There's an earlier draft next to a final draft, and you'll see that there's just like a couple changes that we made to the sort of paragraph that's right underneath the title. We sort of took out the language in the first one of reduce the risks of cannabis to your health and replaced it with understand how you want to receive information about cannabis, just to make it as neutral as possible. And we found that little changes like these did reduce the number of sort of negative comments that we received while promoting these sessions. All right, we also had a difficult time getting people who are pregnant or breastfeeding into the room, which is why we really tried to emphasize through our promotion that we would be engaging in non-judgmental discussions about their experiences. Those who did attend reported that they felt quite nervous about coming, just because Peterborough is a small town. They worried they would be recognized and then there would be negative consequences as a result of that. This taught us that there's a lot of stigma surrounding people who use cannabis and are pregnant or breastfeeding. And while this might not necessarily prevent them from using cannabis, it can prevent them from talking about their use. Okay, so now we're going to go over some of the results from our phone survey. So I'm going to go through a lot of data relatively quickly, so I would like to reiterate that we will be posting the slides and a recording of this presentation to our website, in addition to some infographics to sort of summarize our research. So firstly, we determined that 39% of the population of Peterborough consume cannabis, 21% of the population consume on a daily or weekly basis. 77% of those surveyed believed they were aware of the negative effects of cannabis use, but over 30% could not name an effect. 78% had never heard of the guidelines before. "56% of participants felt that governments and public health systems have not done enough to explain the risks associated with cannabis use, while 14% were unsure. 87% felt that cannabis education should be a priority for the public health system. These numbers illustrate that the public do have an appetite for information about cannabis. And some of the questions that follow this are, so what are people looking for? What do they need? What resonates with them and what doesn't? So online sources and social media were named the most frequently as ways to access public health information. Newspapers, mail, and primary healthcare providers were the next preferred sources. Participants also identified schools, pamphlets, social media, shelters, harm reduction sites, TV, healthcare providers, websites, radio, newspapers, health units, and digital and traditional advertising as good ways to get information to those in the community most at risk for the harms associated with cannabis use. Participants in the phone survey were introduced to and read the guidelines and then asked a series of follow-up questions about them. So using a 5-point scale from 1 very poor to 5 very good, all respondents rated the guidelines in terms of their overall impression and for the content. So the results below combine the total poor as well as total good responses. So 45% of participants said the guidelines are a useful tool for cannabis users or potential users. 30% said neutral, 17% were unsure, and 8% said poor. 36% rated the content and format of the guidelines as good. 18% were neutral, 9% as poor, and 37% were unsure. So here up on the screen is an abbreviated version of the guidelines. I'm just going to read through them quickly. Cannabis use has health risks best avoided by abstaining. Delay taking up cannabis use until later in life. Identify and choose lower risk cannabis products. Don't use synthetic cannabinoids. Avoid smoking burnt cannabis. Choose safer ways of using. If you smoke cannabis, avoid harmful smoking practices. Limit and reduce how often you use cannabis. Don't use and drive or operate other machinery. Avoid cannabis use altogether if you're at risk for mental health problems or are pregnant, and avoid combining these risks. So now the following feedback is from the 6 focus group sessions that we ran. Guidelines number 3, 4, and 6 were observed as being the most achievable. 2, 7, and 8 also seemed like realistic or at least reasonable guidelines to our participants. So when working with patients or clients that are using cannabis, these particular guidelines may be a good way to start the conversation to help them reduce their risks. Numbers 1 and 10 were not very well liked. Number 1 was viewed as redundant and sometimes as stigmatizing. Participants thought that these were the guidelines to reduce harms for those already using, and that it wasn't helpful to point out that they just shouldn't use. They also viewed number 10 as just being redundant. So if a client or patient is coming in and being honest about their use, telling them to stop is probably going to make them feel stigmatized and just less likely to be open again. Participants also felt that more information was needed to be added or discussed as it related to guidelines 5 and 9. So for number 9, participants wanted more information about the safest ways to consume cannabis. So smoking versus vaping versus edibles versus oils, as well as more information on dosages. So like strength of THC, how long the effects will last, etc. Number 9 also states that people who are pregnant or have a history of psychosis or substance use issues should not consume cannabis. Participants thought that this should be separated into 2 points, that it was sort of odd to lump pregnancy in with mental health issues. There was also some debate by participants around the validity of cannabis causing harm during pregnancy. So now I'm going to ask you just to take a moment to picture someone who may use cannabis. What do you see? Who is it that you're picturing? So any of these people up on the screen could be cannabis users. All may come to you for advice, and it is important to remember that all are using cannabis for their own reasons. So our research shows that a large percentage of all age ranges are using cannabis, and that older adults are the most likely age group to ask healthcare professionals about their use. When it comes to who is using cannabis, the stereotype of the teenage stoner is outdated and inaccurate. People of all ages are consuming cannabis for a variety of reasons, and as a service provider, you're a likely source of information for them. So as Evan mentioned earlier, cannabis can be used for many reasons. These may be recreational, social, experimental, or for pain management, both physical and emotional kinds of pain. Cannabis can be used as a coping aid, similar to many other substances. As service providers, we don't have control over client or patient's environment and the details going on in their lives. We have the responsibility to help them make informed decisions, whatever those might be, and provide them with all of the necessary resources to make those decisions. So something that came up in our research several times was that many people do not feel comfortable discussing their cannabis use with helping professionals because of past experiences with or a perceived threat of stigma. It's important to be honest about what we know and what we don't when it comes to cannabis. Participants indicated that they tend to shut down if they feel that the negative effects are being exaggerated or overinflated, or they're being judged for their use. It is also important to recognize that many individuals who may technically be classified as recreational cannabis users often view their use as somewhat medicinal. They may feel very strongly that they have experienced benefits from cannabis that they couldn't find anywhere else. We observe this to be especially true for long-term users. Now, we're not advocating that helping professionals promote cannabis use at all, but the lived experiences of people should be respected. Sometimes cannabis is being used as a form of harm reduction, as an alternative to opioids, self-harm, or other high-risk practices. So we need to learn how to talk about cannabis in ways that do not stigmatize people who use, as well as how to bring up the topic ourselves in a way that might make people feel more comfortable about opening up about it. I'd like you to put yourself in the mindset of a patient or client entering your services. Walk through each step, each person they interact with, each sign they see, each conversation they have. Do any of them discuss cannabis? Can you think of a circumstance where a patient may feel more open about their cannabis use, a sign that prompts them to ask about their use, a pamphlet or a question on the form that they fill out? How about a negative reaction? It may be subtle, but even small cues can cause an individual to feel less open. As an example, think about an intake form that a client or patient is asked to fill out in the waiting room. This person has been waiting for months to get into your service. They come to the reception and are asked to fill out a long form asking all of the necessary questions. Some of the questions begin to ask about behaviors they know may compromise their health and could be viewed as negative by service providers. Finally, they come to a question asking about their cannabis use. They heard about some potential benefits of cannabis from a friend and have started using it to manage pain. They find that it helps. How likely are they in this situation to honestly disclose about their use on the intake form? And more than that, how likely are they to ask their new service provider about cannabis? Very practically, reducing harm begins with addressing stigma. With all substance use, stigma is a major barrier that prevents people from accessing healthcare, treatment, housing, and other critical services. Worst of all, it occurs in a cycle. We all have fixed ideas and judgments about certain things. So for example, thinking that a person with a substance use problem is not normal, not like us, that they cause their own problems. This can lead to fearing or avoiding what we don't understand. So excluding people with substance use problems from regular parts of life, like having a job or accessing a service. Leading that person to get less help, less support, and less care, resulting in any number of poor health outcomes, which brings us back to the first point, perpetuating the whole cycle. For this reason, if we are going to make any progress in reducing the potential health harms of legalization, we need to address the issue of stigma and discrimination, which is a process that begins internally with ourselves. Despite our best intentions and efforts to keep our biases in check, we all carry a level of prejudice within us that manifests in the language that we use, the attitudes that we carry consciously and unconsciously, all of which in turn impact our interactions with others. All of this serves to reinforce that legalization does not mark an endpoint in our understanding of cannabis, but the beginning of a larger process of learning through research, experience, and adaptation to the changes we are seeing in our communities. As we adjust to this new reality, our focus should be on normalizing the conversation around cannabis use, which is very different than normalizing consumption. By engaging in open, unbiased, non-judgmental, and evidence-informed dialogue about cannabis use and its potential benefits and health impacts, we are better equipped to address the possible harms that may surface from cannabis use. So, and in reality, talking more, not less, about all forms of substance use is probably going to be the most effective measure we can take to reduce harms at both an individual and population level. So this quote comes from the Chief Public Health Officer's report on the state of public health in Canada, 2019, which is called Addressing Stigma Towards a More Inclusive Health System. In order to address that root cause of stigma, we absolutely need everybody to hold that mirror up and ask themselves that really important question of how am I implicated in these systems and structures that discriminate, that stereotype, that hurt people? How can I be an agent of change? What can I do to arrest and disrupt those practices and policies that are so harmful to so many of us? All right, and that brings our presentation to a close. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you are interested in learning more, please visit the Cannabis Hub on our website, the link of which is posted on the screen. We have a lot of resources for professionals on things like laws and regulations, health effects, harm reduction, primary care, education, and much more. We will also be posting this webinar recording slides and some more information on the research we conducted to the Hub very shortly. So please stay tuned for that. And now we're going to move into our Q&A period. So if you haven't already, please use the Q&A box to submit your questions and we can address them. I don't know if we want to both get in the frame here. See both of us. Okay. So I'm not seeing any questions right now, so we can just maybe give it a few minutes to see if any come in. There's we have a chat. Oh, thank you. Somebody just commented that they enjoyed the presentation. Glad to hear it.
So, I mean, one thing that we were always curious about with this project, and given some of the challenges, is whether, you know, these sort of roadblocks were something that people encountered in your own setting. I know that a lot of this is really kind of, you know, pertinent or specific to the Ontario context, but, you know, I got a real sense when I was attending conferences or you know, just chatting with other people that there was sort of a real sort of sentiment that these things were shared. I do see a question coming up here. Are there specific areas that you feel, the question, sorry, is that are there specific areas that you feel you need advocacy support? Great question. You know, I think that, you know, just to blow this up a bit, I think that, you know, we all have a role as advocates. You know, one thing that's really great about working in a context of collective impact is that we all have different messaging that we engage in that's reflective of our mandates. And sometimes when this comes together as a whole, it helps us to relate to different audiences. So being aware of the benefits of sort of a collective impact approach can be very beneficial.
The next question. The data from 2017 says that ages 20 to 24-year-old males are the highest use group. What's the latest data for post-legalization? Do we have that on hand?
Unfortunately, I don't have that data right in front of me, but it's all being rolled up through the Stats Hub on the Statistics Canada website. So if you go, or if you do a search term for Cannabis Stats Hub, you should be able to access the most latest reports. I do understand, as I mentioned in the presentation, that there has been some, you know, increases in first-time use, and that those are divided down by age. But again, as I said, you know, we do need to be aware of some of the drivers for that, right? Or to the drivers of those indicators. You know, they can be the fact that, you know, people might be more readily willing to talk about their use. They might be curious. One thing that we've heard from older adults is that you know, they're exploring cannabis, particularly cannabis with high CBD ratios to address pain issues. So there's going to be sort of a phenomenon where we have to keep monitoring the data actively and responding to it as we move forward. So thanks for that question.
We also have a question here in the chat box. Someone says, did I mishear you, or did you say that you created an online module for healthcare providers read cannabis? If so, is there public access to that? So no, we haven't created an online module. What we do have on our Cannabis Hub are just like a big collection of resources, both aimed at the public and at helping professionals, just like that are evidence-based and updated, and just providing information on a variety of issues as it relates to cannabis. We'll also be uploading this presentation, as well as just like some more information on our the research that we conducted, sort of more like public-facing information, just on the data we collected with regards to cannabis use in Peterborough.
Yeah, so we you know, while we're sort of running fast on a short track, we're still producing a lot of stuff, as Sage mentioned. There's some videos, some animated videos that are going to be coming at the end of the month. Sorry, at the end of March 2020. And, you know, so we hope to keep, you know, while we won't have formal funding for this to continue this work, we do hope to sort of continue to make updates. So I do see another question here. Why survey only 800 people? How can you ensure that the sample pool is representative of the community? So for example, proportional representation. So when we designed the survey, we understood that 800 represents an accurate proportional sample based on our population size. We do recognize that with any kind of survey methodology, you're limited to the number of people you can actually contact. We had a limited fixed budget that we had to work with, and so that's why we ended at the number of 800 people.
And I should add too, that's just for our phone survey. So we did actually go slightly over 800 if you include the number of people in our focus group sessions as well.
Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, I think what that serves to recognize is that with any kind of research, you need to be sort of pursuing mixed quantitative and qualitative methods. You know, with quantitative methods, you know, it does give you sort of a large sort of panoptic view of things. Whereas when you do the qualitative work, you get sort of that rich data reflective of sort of the conditions on the ground or what people with lived experience are saying about the issue.
Okay, I don't see, do you see any other questions here?
If there are any last minute questions, feel free to type them in now. Otherwise, we'll close the line.
I'm just gonna put up on our screen. All right, so right now up here on our screen is a link which will also be sent out through email to a survey that we are conducting just to get your feedback on our webinar. As we mentioned earlier, this is our first webinar, so it'd be very helpful to receive some feedback. And we've also just got our contact information on there in case you have any further questions. I think we have one more question here. Did you respond to comments through your Facebook/Twitter, negative comments that were shared?
So this is a great question, and something that for anyone that does work in the world of social media or digital communications is the question of do you or do you not respond? We chose to respond in part because our community is small. Yeah. But you know, we sort of tried to take a very different approach to how we did those responses. You know, so sometimes as Sage was saying that, you know, the tone of the message to us was quite conflictual or reflected a very aggravated stance. And so we really tried to model our communications around sort of a de-escalation of conflict and an intentional effort to transform what people were saying to us. So often what we felt is that the comments that we were receiving on social media were reflective of a bit of a misinterpretation. And that's actually a cue to us to continue to work towards better messages, right?
Yeah.
We can't always control for interpretation, but we felt that it was a respectful to respond in that instance.
Yeah.
Okay, well, seeing no further questions, thank you so much for joining us today. And as Sage said, again, please don't hesitate to get in touch if you have further questions.